Well, good afternoon, Madison Avenue. It's been a while since we've been together on a Wednesday night Bible study, but we've had a few weeks off because of EBA meeting and having the Mattingly family with us and a few other things. But we're back to it this evening and looking forward to getting back into our study of Ezra and Nehemiah. I hope you are as well. So we're going to be looking at lesson number 3 this evening and getting into Ezra's chapter 4 and 5. So if you've not read them, you can pause the video, go read Ezra chapter 4 and 5, and then come back ready for the Bible study. Or you can watch the Bible study first and then go back and read them, however you'd like to do it. But it's so good to have you with us this evening. Let's get right into it and start looking at some of the different things that we have this evening. You'll see the Bible verses are there on the bottom screen for you. Let me see if I can enlarge those a little bit. Yeah, we can blow those up a little so that maybe you can see them a little bit better. And then we'll scroll through our slides together as well today. So lesson number 3 on Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember, let's remind ourselves that this is the reestablishing and the building of the Jewish homeland. They're going to be rebuilding the altar, they're rebuilding the temple, they're rebuilding the walls, and they're rebuilding Jerusalem as a whole after their captivity in Babylon and Persia. So this is an important time in Israel's history, an important time in the Jews' history, Judah and the area there around Jerusalem. So let's get into tonight's lesson, looking and starting at chapter number 4. If we begin in chapter number 4, there's some interesting things here that are taking place. The first 6 verses are dealing with opposition to the rebuilding. They've already started the rebuilding of the altar, and they've got that up, and they've started that. Now they're rebuilding the temple itself, and they're starting to put up the foundation. As a matter of fact, if we remember back to chapter number 3, the foundation had been poured and reset, and they'd had the stones brought in, great big stones brought back in and set in for the foundation, and they were starting to build the walls and bring the timber in as well. And as this building process is going on and on, we're seeing that there's some opposition to the rebuilding. And that's what these first 6 verses in chapter 4 are dealing with, an opposition to the rebuilding. And the adversaries, the opening verse says there was an adversary to Judah and Benjamin. Now, it doesn't say this in these first couple of verses. If you look down there at the bottom of your screen, it just says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel." And so these first 2 opening verses don't give us exactly who it is. But as we continue our reading in chapters 4 and chapters 5, and down the line as well, we can find that this adversary was the Samaritans. Okay, and so the Samaritans were the ones that were that thorn in the flesh. They were the ones that were causing a lot of problems. They were the ones that had the opposition to the rebuilding. And there's some interesting things that take place here. So let's look at those quickly and try and understand what's happening. The Samaritans, let's understand this first and foremost. They were half Jew and half Gentile. These were the people that were born out of the Assyrian captivity. When the northern kingdom of Israel was taken captive, they started mixing with the Assyrians, and the children of the Jews and the Assyrians became the Samaritan race. They're the ones that were half Jew and half Gentiles. So they did not get along with the Jews of the south. They did not get along with Judah. They did not get along with Benjamin. And so they're causing a lot of problems here. And that's who these people were. But the Samaritans came with an odd request. They said, "Hey, we are your half-brothers, if you will. We are your family. We want to see you succeed. And so let us help you build the temple." Now, on the surface, that might sound like a really great offer. Just looking at the surface here, we might say, man, that's really nice of them, right? It's really nice that they're helping to rebuild the temple, that they're coming to help rebuild these things. But there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, the Samaritans should not have been allowed to rebuild the temple. The temple had to be rebuilt specifically by the Levites. It had to be rebuilt by those that were able to rebuild it, that God had called to rebuild it. And so there was a real theological reason why they could not help rebuild the temple. Maybe if they would have come and offered to rebuild some of the walls, maybe Zerubbabel would have been more apt to allow that, and maybe Nehemiah would have allowed them to help do that. But when they come and they request specifically to rebuild the temple, the first problem is they're not Levites. The second problem is they weren't really genuine in their request. Maybe they were coming to try and throw a wrench into things. Maybe they wanted to help so that they could actually destroy from the inside. Maybe they wanted to help rebuild the temple because then they would have claim to it. Well, we helped rebuild this section of it, so we own this section of it. Who knows what their intentions were, but the reality was their intentions were not the right and best intentions. And so they came to help rebuild the temple, and they claimed in this process that they wanted to rebuild the temple because they worshiped the same God that Judah worshipped. And that just simply, it wasn't accurate. It was a lie. They did not worship the same God of heaven. They did not worship the same God that the Jews worshipped. They might have worshiped the God of the Jews, but it was along with 100 other gods. It was well known that they had assimilated themselves into the culture of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians worshipped many, many gods, hundreds of gods. And so while they might have held on to some of the tradition of the Israelites, they might have held on to some of the tradition of their fathers, before they started integrating into the Assyrians. They might have held on to a few of those traditions, a few of those worship practices. They also had a lot of other worship practices. And so when Zerubbabel came, and when Nehemiah came, and when Ezra came, when all these men came to rebuild the altar and the temple and the walls and ultimately the city itself, they did not want the world creeping back in. They wanted to build it holy. They wanted to build it sanctified. And so but Zerubbabel said, no, we're not going to allow it. We don't want you here building the altar, building the temple. We don't need you here helping. God has given us command. God has given us everything that we need. Thank you, but no, we're fine. And so Zerubbabel would not allow them to help build this temple. And that became a problem for the Samaritans. He told them that they had nothing to do with the building of God's house. And this hurt the Samaritans' feelings. They were upset by this. Their feelings got hurt, and because of that, they decided, well, if we're not going to help you build God's house, then you're not going to build God's house. And so they got this revengeful attitude, this thing that they were saying, you know what, we're going to stop you from building it. If we can't build it, you can't build it. And so they're going to cause the Jews a whole lot of trouble. And so this is where we see them start changing their attitude. Now, instead of kind of a behind the curtains attitude of, well, we'll help you build it, but then we want to put our gods in there. And, now they've changed focus. Well, they're not going to let us build it, then we're not going to let them build it. So here's what they did. They went out and they hired counselors. They hired these counselors against Judah to go to the king and to delay the building process. They hired professional liars. That's basically what they did. Let's just get real with it and understand exactly what it was. They hired professional counselors to go to the king and to lie about what they were doing, to lie about who they were, to lie about all their past. They were going and they were building these lies, building all this stuff up to help delay the process so that they would not be able to build what they wanted to build. So they've hired these counselors, and these counselors, they're going to take a little bit of truth and they're going to pile a whole lot of lie on. And now, if we think about that for a moment, that's exactly what Satan does. Satan takes a little bit of truth. He'll take something like what God said in the garden. God said that if they took of the tree of life, that they would die. Satan took the exact words of God and just added a small word and added that they would not die. And so Satan took the exact words of God and just added a little bit. It's the same thing that these hired counselors are going to do. They're going to write a letter to King Artaxerxes, and they're going to tell the king some of the truth, but then they're going to exaggerate it and lie and add a lot of things on that don't need to be on there. So let's look at that. That's actually the second part of this chapter today. As we're still in this same chapter, we're now in verses 7 through 6. And this is the letter sent to King Artaxerxes. This is the letter that the hired counselors are going to write. They're going to sit down. They're going to sit there in Jerusalem. They're going to write down a little bit of what's going on and what's taking place, and they're going to send it with a lot of accusations. So they're writing this letter. They're sending it to the king, King Artaxerxes, and let's look at some of the accusations that they make. First, the first accusation that they make is that the Jews have come and they are building a rebellious and a bad city. Now, here's the little bit of truth, okay? The reality is, before captivity, the Jews, Judah and Benjamin, were rebellious. They were rebellious against the kings that were coming in and trying to take them over. They were trying to maintain their freedom. They were trying to maintain the nation that God had given them. They were trying to maintain what David had ruled over, Solomon had ruled over, what all these men had ruled over. And so, of course, they were rebellious. They were rebellious against Babylon. They were rebellious against Assyria. They were rebellious against these kings that were coming in and trying to take them over. They were rebellious against some of these kings that were trying to come in and take their gold and take their belongings. Of course they were rebellious. But the accusation didn't mention the fact that they were rebellious because they were trying to maintain their freedom. It just added that little bit of detail in. They were a rebellious and bad city. And so by doing that, in this first accusation, they were making the children of Israel look very, very bad, specifically the children of Judah. They were making the children of Judah look like they were a rebellious city and rebels without a cause. And so this is the first accusation that they're writing to the king. They are building a rebellious and a bad city. Second accusation. The second accusation was they've set walls on a foundation. Now, the reason this is a bad accusation is because they were trying to basically make the assumption that the king had not given them permission to build this. Basically, they're trying to trip the king up on his own words. Well, king, you told them they could come and they could worship. You told them that they could come and maybe they could build an altar and sacrifice unto God. But did you know they're actually building foundations, they're building walls, they're rebuilding this city, and they're rebuilding these walls. And here's why this is an important accusation. They're going to start rebuilding these walls, and then they're going to start rebuilding the walls of the city. And once they rebuild the walls of the city, they will have a defense against you, king. Are you really wanting them to rebuild the city so that they can take it, so that they can rebuild those walls, so that they can defend themselves against you? So that's why this accusation of setting the walls, setting a foundation, was such an important accusation. They wanted the king to know, that there was an accusation that was coming, that they were rebuilding the walls for defense. And that's ultimately what this second accusation was about. The third accusation was this: that, once they've rebuilt their altar, they've rebuilt their temple, they've rebuilt their walls, they're going to declare their independence. And king, here's the third accusation: they will no longer pay the tolls, they will no longer pay you tribute, they will no longer pay you their customs. Basically, what they're telling the king is, if they do all of this, they'll no longer pay taxes to you. And so this is the third accusation. And then the fourth accusation: they will damage the revenue of the king. Not only will they no longer pay their toll, tribute, and their custom, but they'll block anything else from coming in from all over that entire area. And so they're really levying that the king wants that land, the king wants that money, the king wants those people, the king wants his tribute. They're really levying that the king wants all of this. And if the king wants it, the king's not going to get it if he allows this building process to continue on. And that is the basis of their letter. They're trying to convince the king to stop the building, because if he allows the building to continue on, he will lose Judah as a nation. And so these are the accusations. The hired men are requesting that the king would search the records. They're saying, King, listen, just search the records. You'll see that they were rebellious people, that the kings that came before you had a difficult time with them. You'll see all of these things. They have always been a rebellious people. And so they're pleading with the king, just go back and search the records. Find what has been done. And so ultimately, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to accomplish? I believe, now this is a little bit of my opinion, but I believe we can kind of back this up biblically. If we just kind of lay it all out, I think it makes sense. They close the letter this way. This is ultimately what they're trying to do. They're trying to scare the king into thinking that he will lose his land, everything on the west side of the Jordan. That once they get in there and they establish Jerusalem, then they will expand and they'll establish Judah. And if they've expanded and established Judah, they'll just take Israel and they'll take it all. And so they're literally trying to scare the king and say, listen, you need to stop this now before it gets any worse. And so this is the letter that they've compiled. This is what they're sending to Artaxerxes to get him to stop the building process. The chapter ends, verses 17 through 24, with the king ordering them to stop. The king Artaxerxes reads the letter, sees the concerns of the Samaritans, and he kind of says, basically, here's what he says is the end of this chapter, this section, there in chapter number 17, begins with basically him saying, thank you for the warning. Thank you for letting me know. I wasn't aware of all of this. We went back and we searched the records. And when we searched the records, we found out you were right. Thank you for the warning. And he fell for the letter, exactly what the Samaritans wanted. I mean, hook, line, and sinker. He did exactly what the hired help was hired to do. They were hired to cause doubt. They were hired to cause fear. They were hired to get him to stop. And it's exactly what happened. Everything that they wanted done is exactly what he did. Look back here, chapter number 5 with me, a couple of the verses. It says, then the prophets... not chapter... We're still in chapter 4, excuse me. We're just at the very bottom of chapter number 4, verse 17. Then sent the king an answer. And here's the answer that he sent. He said, verse number 18, the letter that you sent was plainly read before me. The letter I read it all. I looked at everything that you had for me. And look what verse number 19 says. And I commanded, and search was made. Search had been made. And it was found that this city in old time had made insurrection against the kings, and that they rebelled, and sedition had been made. And so the king said, we did search the records, and we did find that the people were a rebellious people. And so he read about them. He also read, here's another interesting thing, if we get down here into verse number 20 and 21, he also read about the mighty kings over Israel and how they had ruled over other countries, and how kings like David and Solomon, not only had they ruled over other countries, but they had required taxes and tributes to be sent into Jerusalem. And so basically what Artaxerxes is reading here is he's reading, listen, if they once had kings that were over them, that taxed other people, that ruled over other people, then now that the tables are turned, they should expect the same thing. And so Artaxerxes, he is just falling for this 100%. He's not listening to God. He's reading the letter from the Samaritans. He's reading the history about Israel and how Israel was rebellious against the other kings. And so he's putting all of this together, and here's what the king is going to say. The king's going to say, well, okay, let's send this command. I agree. Let's stop the work. So the king gave commandment for the work to stop, and he said, it's stopping indefinitely until a new king is given that you can a new command is given by the king that you can restart. And so it's an indefinite stoppage of the work. He's saying no longer until we reevaluate things. And as soon as the Samaritans got this in their hand, as soon as they saw the letter, as soon as they saw the information, as soon as they had it, they ran straight to Jerusalem and forcefully stopped the Jews from building, stopped the process, stopped the temple build, and they said, nope, you can't do this anymore. Here it is, signed from the king, and we got you to stop. And so they rubbed it in Judah's face, they rubbed it in Benjamin's face, and they said, you can no longer do it. They stopped it all the way until the second year of Darius. All right, let's look into chapter number 5 now. As we get into chapter number 5, we're going to see some other interesting things happen. We see the rebuilding restarts. Now, we'll notice here as we get in, the king didn't give permission for the build to restart, but we'll get into that. Let's look at a couple of things here. Rebuilding restarts, verses 1 through 5 of Ezra chapter number 5. Let's look here at the very first couple of points. Letter A, Haggai and Zechariah. Now, those two names should ring a bell to you because there are two books in the Old Testament written by Haggai and Zechariah. You can look them up at the very end of the Old Testament. But Haggai and Zechariah are they're contemporaries here to Ezra and to Nehemiah, and they're there in Jerusalem, and they begin to preach. They begin to preach unto the Jews, and the hearts of the Jews were stirred. The hearts were stirred, and not just any Jews, but the hearts of Zerubbabel, the heart of Jeshua, they were stirred, and they said, you know what? We're not going to listen to no king. We're going to listen to God. And God's told us to rebuild, and so we're going to start rebuilding again. So they got up, they began to rebuild again, and this time they began to rebuild without the permission from the king. They said, no, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to start doing it. So the Samaritans came, they got wind of it, they said, whoa, wait a minute. We never got word that the king said they could start rebuilding. What's going on here? And so they go back down into Jerusalem, and they get into Jerusalem, and they say, what are you doing? And so the Samaritans are going to try and stop them again. But the Samaritans ask, who told you could restart? Who told you could start building again? And but the Jews answered and said, we don't need any permission. God has told us to do this. We're going to continue to build. And so Tatnai, if I'm saying that right, I'm probably not. This is one of the hired helps of the Samaritans. He begins to write another letter. He's going to write another letter unto the king. And so that's what verses 6 through 17 are about, the latter half of chapter number 5 here. And so he's going to write another letter. Let's look at just a couple of this. Verse number 6 tells us, here's a copy of the letter that was sent unto King Darius. And verse number 8, be it known unto the king that we went into the province of Judah to the house of the great God, which is builded with great stones, and timber is laid in the walls. And this work goeth fast on, and prospereth in their hands. And so another letter is going out. The hired help is sending this out, and a new king is in place. Darius is now there, and the hired help of the Samaritans figure they better start it all over with their accusations. Now, what's different about this letter is it's almost like they realize this is a new king that doesn't understand the background, a new king that doesn't know what's going on, and so the hired help of the Samaritans figure we better go back and start from the beginning. We better go back and make sure that he knows what's going on. And so they go all the way back, and they make sure in this letter to tell the king about how Judah was taken captive. And again, explaining how Judah was rebellious. And again, these are their words, okay? That Judah was rebellious and that they were a bad city and a bad town. And the kings came in and took them captive. And they've been captive for so many years. And so they went back and they kind of started the story from the beginning. Well, in this letter, as they finally get back to current times, in this letter they tell the king that the house of God was being built with great stones. that timber had already been laid. Timber was already there on the walls, and that this building process had been restarted without the king's permission. And so they're just letting the king know everything from the beginning to the current time. Well, in verse number 8, they specifically tell the king, hey, listen, they were supposed to be stopped. They've restarted the work. If you want to stop it again, you better get down here and let them know now, because verse number 8 says they were going very fast. They were rebuilding with urgency. They were trying to get it done as quickly as possible. So after giving Darius kind of a history lesson of what all is going on, they ask him, say, so what do you want us to do? And so they asked the king, they said, King, just search the records. Go back and search the records again. See what decisions had been made in the past. And they sneak cleverly, they sneak a very innocent phrase in. They're very clever about it. They're very innocent about it. Almost making it sound like they wanted King Darius to find the decree that allowed the Jews to build. This was the way that they worded it. They said, just go back and search the records, and we don't know, maybe you'll find a record that allowed the Jews to build. Maybe you'll find a record where it allowed the Jews to go and to leave Babylon and to leave Assyria and to go back to their hometown and build. Maybe you'll find that, king. Why don't you search the records? And it sounds so innocent, right? But it's very, very clever, because here's the reality. Here's the reality. In searching for their building decree, in searching for that decree where the Jews were allowed to go back and they were allowed to build, they'll also find the cease and desist order. They'll also find the order from the previous king that said no, from Artaxerxes, where Artaxerxes said they needed to stop. They don't need to build anymore. They shouldn't be building, because if they continue to build, they'll cut themselves off. They'll be rebellious. And so, yes, they're very innocent and clever in the way they send this letter. Why don't you see if you can find a place where they were allowed to build? But you see, in searching for that building decree, they're also going to find the cease and desist order. And that is the real reason they wanted the king to search the records. They wanted the king to search because they knew if they searched the records, they'd find the record that said stop building. So these hired help of the Samaritans, they're very clever, they're very smart, they knew what they were doing, they knew what they were writing. They took a little bit of truth and they stretched it to lie a mile. And that's what's happening, and that's what's taking place here. Well, that brings us to the end of our lesson today. That brings us to the end of lesson number 3. We looked at Ezra chapter 4 and 5. Unfortunately, we're going to be off for a couple of more weeks. Next week, I will be on vacation, so Bible study will be in person only. No video stream next Wednesday. The following Wednesday, we might live stream. We'll have a special guest speaker with us, a missionary. Brandon Rutherford will be with us and speaking that Wednesday night, so we might live stream his presentation that evening, but there won't be a pre-recorded Bible study that night. So our next lesson number 4 on Ezra and Nehemiah, will be 3 weeks out. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope to see you here that week, and when we get to it, we'll be looking over again Ezra chapters 6 and 7. So I hope that you will come and join us that week, and that we will have a good time then. God bless you. Have a wonderful week. I hope that you have a very good day, the rest of your day. God bless you, and we will see you very, very soon.